I never planned to work at a place like Blackwood Academy, and if I'm being honest, I probably should have questioned how a school with such a prestigious reputation could be so desperate to hire a teacher that they offered me the position before I even finished the interview. I wasn't their first choice, hell, I probably wasn't even in their top 10, but the pay was generous, the living accommodations were free, and after bouncing between underfunded public schools and temporary substitute jobs for the past 3 years, I wasn't in a position to be picky. The email came late at night, a single, cryptic message that read, "Blackwood Academy formally invites you to join our faculty. Immediate placement available. Do not delay. No offer letter, no contract attached, just an address and a date, 2 days from now." Something about it felt cold, impersonal, almost unnatural, but my bank account was empty, my rent was overdue, and I was too tired to read between the lines of a message that, at the time, I had convinced myself was nothing more than a professional formality. The drive took me deeper into the mountains than I expected, winding roads carved through towering pine trees that swallowed the sky, their branches so thick and interwoven that even at noon, the world felt dim and shadowed, like the sun itself wasn't welcome here. My GPS signal cut out 2 hours before I reached the school gates, leaving me to rely on the old, weathered road signs that pointed me toward Blackwood Academy for the exceptionally gifted, EST 1873, the paint faded, the metal rusting, as if time had tried to erase the name but hadn't quite finished the job. When I finally arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence, deep, heavy, unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath. The wrought iron gates creaked open before I even touched them, groaning on their hinges like they hadn't been used in years, and beyond them, the school loomed, a towering, Gothic structure of blackened stone and narrow, cathedral-like windows that stretched so high into the sky that I almost expected them to pierce through the clouds. I expected some kind of welcoming committee, at the very least a secretary or a student assigned to give me a tour, but instead, the entrance hall was empty, the only sound the distant echo of my own footsteps against the polished wooden floor. The chandeliers overhead flickered weakly, their light dim and sickly, as if struggling against the weight of the shadows pressed into every corner, and for the first time, I felt the sharp, unshakable certainty that I was not supposed to be here. Before I could turn back, before I could second-guess my decision, a voice called out from the grand staircase, cold, measured, female, and I turned to see a tall, severe-looking woman descending toward me, her expression a perfect, unreadable mask. "You are late, Miss Carter," she said, though there was no annoyance in her voice, only something heavy, something distant, something that sent an immediate chill through my chest. "Follow me." Headmistress Voss did not waste time on pleasantries. She led me down a series of impossibly long corridors, her sharp heels clicking against the floor in perfect rhythm, never slowing, never hesitating, never so much as glancing back to see if I was keeping up. As we walked, I noticed the portraits that lined the walls, all of them dark, oil-painted depictions of past faculty, their faces half swallowed by shadow, their eyes just slightly off, their expressions frozen in something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a frown, but something in between, something unnatural, something that made my stomach twist with unease. "There are rules you must follow here," Headmistress Voss continued, her voice smooth, practiced, as if she had given this same speech to hundreds before me. "You will teach your assigned classes. You will not ask unnecessary questions. You will not enter the East Wing after dark. And most importantly," her footsteps stopped, and for the first time, she turned to look at me directly, "you will not, under any circumstances, attempt to leave without permission." It was only then, standing there beneath the weight of her gaze, that I realized something was very, very wrong, though I could not yet name it, could not yet understand the heavy, sinking feeling in my stomach, the prickling awareness along the back of my neck, the deep and unsettling certainty that I had just walked into something much older, much darker, much more dangerous than I could ever begin to comprehend. That night, as I lay in bed in the small, cold dormitory they had assigned to me, staring up at the cracked ceiling and listening to the way the silence pressed in on all sides like something living, something waiting, I told myself that my nerves were getting the best of me, that my imagination was running wild, that I was overthinking things, that I was safe. But sometime after midnight, as I drifted in and out of restless, uneasy sleep, I heard it, the whispering. Soft, rhythmic, crawling through the vents, threading through the walls, seeping in from the darkened hallways outside. It did not sound like English. It did not sound like any language I had ever heard before. And it was coming from the East Wing. I didn't sleep that first night, though I told myself I had, lying stiff beneath the scratchy wool blankets, staring at the thin sliver of moonlight that cut across the ceiling like a wound, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silent, to the nearly imperceptible sound of something moving in the walls, shifting, breathing, whispering just beneath the threshold of understanding. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that the isolation of the school, the strangeness of the day, the exhaustion of the long drive had left me raw and easily spooked, that my mind was playing tricks on me, twisting the ordinary into something monstrous, something unnatural, something that wasn't really there. But as the night stretched on, as the minutes bled into hours, as the whispers ebbed and flowed like waves against the shore, I knew, with a kind of cold certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was not imagining things, that the sound was real, that something, or someone, was awake long after the rest of the school had gone still. By morning, the rational part of my brain had managed to shove the fear down into some quiet, buried place, wrapping it in logic and excuses, convincing me that whatever I'd heard had an explanation, that old buildings creaked, that pipes groaned, that the wind had a way of making voices out of nothing. I had almost managed to believe it when Headmistress Voss found me in the dining hall, standing at the long, wooden buffet table, pouring myself a cup of tea with hands that I refused to acknowledge were still slightly trembling. She didn't greet me, didn't ask how my first night had been, didn't offer a single word of small talk before saying, in that smooth, unhurried way of hers, "You heard them, didn't you?" I felt the blood drain from my face so fast I nearly dropped the cup, the delicate porcelain clinking against the saucer as I forced my expression into something neutral, something blank, something that didn't betray the way my pulse had just lurched violently in my throat. "I don't know what you mean," I said, though we both knew I was lying. Headmistress Voss studied me for a long moment, her gaze sharp, assessing, weighing something I couldn't name before finally saying, "The East Wing is off limits for a reason, Miss Carter. Whatever you think you heard last night, you will ignore it. You will not investigate it. You will not speak of it again." Her voice was even, calm, entirely without emotion, but beneath the surface of that perfect, polished composure, there was something else, something colder, something that almost felt like a warning. I wanted to ask why, wanted to press her for answers, wanted to demand to know what exactly I had heard in the dark, but some instinct, some deep, primal thing inside me, told me not to push, told me that I did not want to know, that some questions were better left unanswered. Instead, I forced a tight, practiced smile, nodded as if I understood, as if I agreed, as if I was the kind of person who followed rules without question, and said, "Of course, Headmistress." The rest of the day passed in a strange, muted blur, filled with whispered introductions, perfectly polite students who sat with perfectly straight postures, hands folded neatly on their desks, their glassy, unblinking eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin prickle with unease. It wasn't until after dinner, as I walked through the empty corridors toward my dorm, that I saw it, the first real crack in the school's carefully controlled facade. A boy, no older than 13, stood alone at the far end of the hallway, his small frame half swallowed by the shadows, his hands at his sides, his head tilted slightly, unnaturally, like a marionette with its strings tangled. He was staring at me. Not just watching, not just looking, but staring, eyes so wide, so unyielding, so utterly devoid of movement that my breath hitched painfully in my throat, some deep, animal part of me screaming to look away, to move, to run. But before I could so much as take a step, before I could blink, before I could even force air into my lungs, the boy did something that made my stomach drop. He smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile a child should have, wasn't warm or friendly or shy, wasn't hesitant or uncertain or nervous, it was slow, deliberate, unnatural, stretching too far, revealing teeth that were too white, too even, too perfect, as if they had never been used, never touched food, never bitten, never chewed, never belonged to something human at all. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating, pressing against my skin like a warning, like a hand on the back of my neck, and for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Academy, I felt something deeper than unease, something colder than dread, something worse than fear. I felt the undeniable, gut-wrenching certainty that I was in the wrong place, that I should not be here, that I needed to leave immediately. But as I took a slow, shaky step backward, as my fingers brushed against the cool metal of my door handle, as I forced myself to break eye contact with the boy's too wide smile, I realized something else, something much, much worse. I had never seen him blink. Not even for a second. The more time I spent at Blackwood Academy, the more I became aware of the way the students watched me, their wide, unblinking eyes following my every movement, tracking me across the room with the kind of silent, unwavering focus that made my stomach twist and my pulse hammer uncomfortably against my ribs. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that they were simply well-disciplined, that their intensity was a product of the school's rigid structure, but there was something deeper, something wrong, something I couldn't quite name in the way their gazes never faltered, never flickered, never shifted away from me, not even for a second. They sat so still, their bodies perfectly aligned, their hands folded neatly on their desks, their expressions eerily neutral, as if they were waiting, not for instruction, not for permission, but for something else entirely. By the third day, my nerves had begun to fray at the edges, the relentless, suffocating sensation of being observed burrowing under my skin, making my every movement feel slow and calculated, like an animal trapped in the sights of something predatory, something patient, something waiting for the exact moment to strike. I found myself hyper-aware of my own blinking, the way my eyelids moved over my vision, the dry scratch of exhaustion creeping into my eyes, the constant, nagging feeling that I was the only one in the room who ever closed them. I started testing them, asking questions at random, trying to catch them off guard, trying to see if even one of them would break their stare, but they never did, answering in the same calm, measured tones, their voices perfectly in sync, perfectly polite, perfectly unnatural. The only student who seemed different was Clara, a quiet, pale girl who sat near the window, her gaze always slightly unfocused, as if she was trying not to look at me directly, as if she was avoiding something the others embraced. That afternoon, as I dismissed class and watched the students file out in their eerily synchronized manner, Clara hesitated for the briefest moment, her small hands tightening into fists at her sides, her breathing shallow, uneven, her lips parting like she wanted to speak, but then, just as quickly, she was gone, disappearing into the sea of stiff postures and glassy, vacant eyes, and I was left standing there, gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles ached. That night, long after the halls had gone still, after the candles lining the corridors had burned low, after the strange and endless whispering had begun to slip through the cracks in the walls like something living, I caught my own reflection in the tall, dust-streaked mirror by my door, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting strange, flickering shadows across my face. I was exhausted, my eyes red-rimmed, my body heavy with the weight of sleepless nights and unanswered questions, but as I reached up to rub at the deep ache behind my temple, my reflection did not move. It stood there, perfectly still, its gaze locked onto mine, its expression empty, lifeless, unreadable, and for the first time since arriving at Blackwood, I felt something cold and sharp pierce through my mind, something dark and heavy coil around my ribs like a warning. I was not alone in this room. And then, just as the breath hitched in my throat, just as the weight of its gaze began to crush the air from my lungs, just as I willed myself to move, to blink, to do something, it smiled. The next morning, I found myself standing outside Headmistress Voss's office, my pulse hammering so violently in my throat that I could barely breathe, my fingers clenched so tightly around the doorknob that my knuckles ached, but I forced myself to steady my breathing, to swallow the rising panic, to tell myself that I was just imagining things, that I had been overtired, that the stress of adjusting to the school was making me see things that weren't there. I repeated those lies over and over again in my mind, but they unraveled the moment I stepped inside and found her already staring at me, as if she had been waiting, as if she had known I would come, her cold, sharp gaze pinning me in place before I could even speak. "You have questions," she said, her voice eerily even, eerily patient, as though she had already decided how this conversation would end. I hesitated, suddenly unsure whether asking them was a mistake, suddenly aware that I was balancing on something precarious, something fragile, something that could shatter beneath me if I said the wrong thing. I told her I wanted to know what had happened to the teacher before me, that I had overheard the students mention her name, Miss Howard, but none of them seemed to know where she had gone, only that one day she had been here, and the next, she had not. I tried to keep my voice steady, to keep my expression neutral, but I knew she could see through it, could hear the unease beneath my words, could sense the sharp edge of doubt buried beneath my carefully measured tone. Miss Howard left on her own accord, Headmistress Voss said, but the words were empty, too rehearsed, too perfectly precise, and something in my gut twisted violently, because I knew she was lying, knew that if I pushed just a little harder, if I peeled back the layers of Blackwood's carefully controlled facade, I would find something rotting underneath. When I didn't respond, when I stood there in silence, waiting, watching, barely breathing, she finally lifted her chin, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities, Miss Carter," she said, her voice quieter now, colder, heavier, as if it was no longer a suggestion, as if it was a warning. "Curiosity is not encouraged here." That night, I sat at my desk, staring down at the lesson plan Miss Howard had left behind, the pages yellowed and brittle beneath my fingertips, the ink smudged in places where someone's hand had pressed too hard, lingered too long, like they had been writing in a hurry, like they had been afraid. It was mostly unremarkable, neatly structured, carefully organized, but in the margins, scribbled in handwriting so jagged it looked almost frantic, were 3 words that made my breath hitch in my throat, that made the room feel too small, too suffocating, too filled with something I could not see. "Do not look into their eyes." My skin prickled, my stomach twisted, my body screamed at me to stop reading, to shove the notebook away, to pretend I had never seen it, but I couldn't, not now, not when every single nerve in my body was telling me that Miss Howard hadn't left, that she hadn't simply walked away, that something had happened to her, something terrible, something the school had erased, something they would do to me if I wasn't careful. I barely slept, barely moved, barely breathed, my mind replaying the words over and over again like a broken record, trying to understand, trying to make sense of the impossible, but it wasn't until just before dawn, when the whispering in the walls had finally begun to fade, when the first pale sliver of morning light had crept through my window, that I noticed something else, something that had not been there before. The notebook was still open on my desk, but the words, the warning, were gone. The ink had vanished, the margins clean and empty as if nothing had ever been written at all. And for the first time since arriving at Blackwood, I knew, with an aching, sinking certainty, that I was being watched. I barely made it through my morning classes, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me like something physical, my body sluggish, my thoughts tangled, my skin still crawling from the absence of those words in Miss Howard's notebook, from the way the ink had simply disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. Every time I turned my back to write on the board, I could feel them watching, their unblinking eyes drilling into me, their expressions so still, so eerily neutral, that it made my stomach twist violently every time I forced myself to look back. I could barely focus on my lessons, barely string together coherent thoughts, because my mind was trapped in a relentless loop of paranoia, whispering over and over that something was wrong, that something was missing, that there was a piece of this puzzle I wasn't seeing. And so, instead of returning to my quarters after my last class, instead of trying to sleep, instead of pretending that everything was normal, I did something I knew I wasn't supposed to do. I went to the library. The Blackwood Academy library was enormous, far too large for the number of students, a cavernous, 2-story structure with towering shelves that stretched toward a ceiling so high and shadowed that it seemed to disappear into darkness. The air was thick with dust and the faint, musty scent of ancient paper, and as I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, I realized with a slow, creeping unease that there was no one else here. No students, no faculty, no librarian at the front desk, just rows and rows of books, stretching endlessly in every direction, their cracked spines and yellowed pages holding secrets no one had bothered to share with me. I moved carefully, my fingers trailing along the worn bindings, my pulse thrumming in my throat as I searched for, what, exactly? A clue? A name? Something to explain why Miss Howard had vanished, why my students never blinked, why their eyes were always so wide, so glassy, so utterly wrong. It wasn't until I reached the farthest corner of the library, where the air was heavier, thicker, wrong, that I saw it, a section of books locked behind a rusted iron gate. The shelves beyond it were older than the rest, the books themselves massive, their covers leather-bound and cracked, their titles written in a language I didn't recognize, the letters jagged and uneven, as though they had been carved instead of written. There was a sign bolted to the gate, the words so faded they were almost unreadable, but as I leaned closer, as I ran my fingers over the surface, I could just barely make out the message underneath the grime: restricted archives, headmistress's permission required. My pulse quickened, my skin prickling with something between fear and exhilaration, because if Headmistress Voss didn't want me in there, it meant that was exactly where I needed to be. The lock was old, rusted, practically crumbling at the edges, and after a few desperate tugs, the metal finally snapped, the heavy chain slipping from the gate with a dull clatter that seemed to echo too loudly in the empty library. I slipped inside, heart hammering, hands shaking, running my fingers along the dust-covered spines, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening in this school, what had happened to Miss Howard, what was happening to me. And then, almost as if it had been waiting for me, my gaze landed on a massive black book, its cover unmarked, its edges stained with something dark, something I hoped was just ink. The second I opened it, the air around me seemed to shift, the candlelight flickering violently, the shadows stretching unnaturally, as if the room itself was watching. The pages were filled with symbols, unfamiliar and chaotic, drawn in thick, jagged strokes, but there was one phrase, one single sentence scrawled over and over again in English, pressed so hard into the page that the paper had nearly torn. And as I read it, my breath caught, my vision blurred, my body went cold, because I understood now, because I finally knew what Miss Howard had been trying to tell me, what she had been trying to warn me about before she vanished. The gift of everlasting sight comes at a cost. I barely made it through dinner, my appetite long gone, my body locked in the stiff, mechanical motions of someone trying too hard to seem normal, trying too hard to pretend they weren't drowning beneath the weight of something they didn't understand. My mind was still caught in the tangled web of that book, of that single, horrifying sentence, of the whispering realization that whatever was happening at Blackwood, whatever had happened to Miss Howard, whatever was wrong with these students, it all came down to that one cryptic phrase. I could feel the edges of a truth pressing in around me, just out of reach, brushing against my thoughts like cold fingers in the dark, but I wasn't ready to face it, wasn't ready to name it, wasn't ready to acknowledge the deep, sinking certainty that I had stepped into something ancient, something unnatural, something so carefully hidden that even speaking of it felt dangerous. And yet, despite all of it, despite the unease coiling in my stomach, despite the suffocating silence of the dining hall, despite the dozens of unblinking eyes locked onto me, it wasn't until I saw Clara watching me from across the table, her fingers shaking, her breath shallow, her expression filled with something I could only describe as pleading, that I finally understood, I wasn't the only one who was afraid. She didn't approach me at first, didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even break her rigid, statuesque posture, but the longer I sat there, the longer I felt her eyes on me, the longer I stared at my untouched plate, the more I knew she was waiting for me to do something, to acknowledge her, to listen. When I finally looked up, meeting her gaze, her lips barely parted, her throat bobbing in a shallow, nervous swallow, and for a single, breathless moment, I thought she might say something, thought she might shatter the oppressive silence, thought she might tell me the truth I had been searching for since the moment I stepped foot in this school. But before she could, before the words could slip past her lips, before she could even take a breath to try, the boy beside her turned his head sharply, the movement too fast, too unnatural, too wrong, and I swear to God, I saw his pupils shrink, saw his mouth twitch into something that wasn't quite a smile, saw his fingers dig just a little too hard into the table. Clara went rigid, her body snapping back into that same eerily perfect posture, her eyes going wide, too wide, like she had just realized she had made a terrible mistake, like she had been caught in the act of something forbidden, something dangerous, something that could not be undone. Her face drained of color, her hands clenched into trembling fists at her sides, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths, and then, without another word, she shoved back her chair and hurried from the room, her movements stiff, forced, unnatural, like she was fighting against something I couldn't see. I wanted to follow her, wanted to grab her arm and demand she tell me what the hell was going on, wanted to shake her and force her to speak before it was too late, before whatever had silenced Miss Howard silenced her too, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think, because every single other student in that dining hall was still staring at me. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even try, didn't dare close my eyes for more than a second, because I knew, deep in my bones, with a certainty that made my entire body shake, that if I did, I would wake up to find Clara gone. The next morning, Clara was missing. No one acknowledged it, no one mentioned her name, no one acted as though anything had changed at all, and yet, somehow, that made it worse, made it feel as though she had been erased, as though her presence had been nothing more than a passing thought, a faint whisper that had been swallowed by the walls of Blackwood itself. I waited, listening for any sign that the other students had noticed, that they had questions, that they cared, but they sat as they always did, their backs impossibly straight, their hands folded neatly, their expressions blank, their wide, unblinking eyes fixed on me with something that felt heavier than it had before, something that felt like a warning. I tried to focus, tried to teach, tried to get through the day without unraveling, but I couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop seeing the look in her eyes before she ran, couldn't stop feeling the certainty that whatever had happened to Miss Howard had now happened to her. By the time the sun had set, painting the school in deep shadows and bruised light, I found myself wandering the halls aimlessly, the heavy silence of the empty corridors pressing down on me like something tangible, something suffocating, something that curled itself around my ribs and refused to let go. I didn't know where I was going, didn't even know what I was looking for, but some deep, gnawing instinct kept pulling me forward, leading me through the darkened hallways, past the locked doors, past the candlelit alcoves where the flames barely flickered, past the portraits of former headmasters that lined the walls, their oil-painted faces half hidden in shadow, their expressions unreadable, their eyes. My breath hitched, my pulse stuttered, my body locking into place as a cold, creeping realization slithered down my spine like ice, because their eyes had been scratched out. Every single one. I stepped closer, my hands shaking, my breath uneven, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear the silence around me, but it was there, undeniable, horrifying, the faces of every headmaster, every teacher, every figure that had ever served at Blackwood, their eyes reduced to deep, jagged gouges in the canvas, their hollow, empty sockets somehow staring at me even without them. And then, at the very end of the hall, I saw it, the largest portrait of them all, its frame ornate and gold-leafed, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust that seemed untouched, undisturbed, as though no one had dared to come near it for a very, very long time. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see, didn't want to know, but my body moved before my mind could stop it, my feet carrying me forward, my fingers trembling as they reached out, as they wiped away just enough dust to reveal the name carved into the plaque below. Dr. Edwin Blackwood. The founder of the school. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp, my knees nearly giving out beneath me, because his eyes were still there. They had not been scratched away, had not been gouged from the canvas, had not been erased like the others. They were still there, and they were staring directly at me. And in the flickering candlelight, in the shifting glow of the dim hallway, in the unnatural stillness that settled around me like something living, I swear to God, they moved. I don't remember walking back to my room, don't remember how I got there, don't remember unlocking the door or shutting it behind me, only that when I finally came back to myself, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling so violently that I could barely unclench my fingers, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My skin felt cold, damp with sweat, my pulse an erratic, stuttering thing beneath my ribs, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that paintings do not move, that portraits do not watch, that dead men do not see, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something wrong, that I had broken some unspoken rule, that I had looked at something I was never meant to see. The air in the room felt different now, thicker, heavier, pressing against my skin like a second layer, like something unseen had followed me from that hallway, like something was waiting. I must have fallen asleep at some point, though I don't remember closing my eyes, don't remember when exhaustion finally pulled me under, but when I woke up, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The room was dark, far too dark, darker than it should have been, the dim glow from the candle I had left burning on my desk now nothing more than a weak ember struggling against the void. My body felt sluggish, weighted, like something was holding me down, like something was wrapped around my limbs, and when I tried to move, tried to lift my head, tried to breathe, I realized I couldn't. My eyes darted frantically around the room, my pulse hammering in my throat, and that was when I saw them, the eyes. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, hovering in the dark, disembodied, hollow, empty, yet somehow still seeing, still knowing, still watching. The whispering started then, that same guttural, inhuman voice that I had heard my first night at Blackwood, only now it was closer, clearer, as though it was inside the room, inside my head, curling around my thoughts like cold fingers. "Do not look away," it murmured, the words slithering through the air, sliding beneath my skin, sinking into the marrow of my bones. My chest seized with fear, my lungs burning, my body locked in place, but I could not close my eyes, could not turn away, could not move, because no matter where I looked, the eyes were still there, shifting, watching, reflecting the weak flicker of dying candlelight like glass. My vision blurred, black spots creeping in at the edges, panic clawing its way up my throat, and just as I felt myself slipping, just as I thought I would pass out from sheer terror, from the unbearable weight of being seen, a sharp, violent knock shattered the silence. The eyes were gone. The whispering stopped. The darkness receded just enough for me to suck in a desperate, gasping breath, and for a long, trembling moment, I simply sat there, paralyzed, shaking, unsure if I was even awake, unsure if I was still trapped in some nightmare that refused to end. But the knock came again, softer this time, hesitant, uncertain, and when I finally forced my body to move, when I finally turned my head toward the door, toward the small sliver of flickering candlelight spilling in from the hallway, I saw something that nearly made my heart stop. Slipped beneath the crack of the door, half hidden in shadow, was a single, pale, bloodless hand. And in the dim glow of the candlelight, I could see that it was shaking. I don't remember falling asleep. But when I woke up, I knew, immediately, undeniably, sickeningly, that something was wrong. The air felt thick, damp, clinging to my skin like cold breath, the silence was so complete, so suffocating, that I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and unsteady, hammering against my ribs like it was trying to warn me, trying to tell me to move, to run, to do something. But I couldn't move. At first, I thought it was sleep paralysis, that awful sensation of waking up before your body does, that helpless, weightless feeling of being trapped inside yourself, but this was different. This was something else. My limbs weren't just heavy, they felt like they weren't mine, like they had been pinned down by something unseen, something pressing against my chest, something holding me in place. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the way you feel the air shift when someone is standing too close behind you, the way your body knows when something isn't right before your mind catches up. And then, the whispering began. It started as a faint murmur, just on the edge of hearing, words spoken in a language I didn't understand, syllables curling and twisting in ways that felt wrong, unnatural, inhuman. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It wasn't slipping through the cracks in the walls. It was in the room with me. My breath hitched, my throat tightening with panic, my pulse pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, and I tried, God, I tried, to turn my head, to move my hands, to do anything but lie there, helpless, but I couldn't. And then, slowly, softly, something touched me. Cold, thin fingers pressing against my wrist. A shudder tore through me, my breath hitching violently in my throat, my skin crawling with the unbearable sensation of something that shouldn't be there, something that wasn't human. I couldn't see it, couldn't move, couldn't scream, but I felt it lean closer, felt the whispering breath against my ear, felt the unnatural stillness of the air as it spoke my name. Not a question. Not a statement. Just a single, drawn-out syllable, as if tasting the sound of it, as if savoring it, as if claiming it as its own. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. The weight lifted, my body jolted upright, my lungs finally sucking in a desperate, ragged gasp, my shaking hands clutching the blanket as if it could protect me. But I already knew, I had brought something back with me from the library. And it was still here. I barely made it through the next day, my body running on nothing but raw, frayed nerves and the sharp, sickening certainty that something had changed, that something had shifted inside Blackwood, that I was no longer just an outsider wandering too close to a secret, I was a part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. The students watched me more than before, their unblinking stares heavier, sharper, filled with something I couldn't name, something that curled at the edges of my mind like smoke, something that made my skin crawl with the unbearable sensation of being seen. The whispers had followed me from my room, slipping beneath the threshold of the door, curling down the hallways, threading through the silence of the classroom, a constant, murmuring presence just at the edge of my hearing, never loud enough to understand, but never truly gone. And worse, so much worse than all of it, was the feeling that every time I blinked, something changed. It was small at first, barely noticeable, a book slightly out of place, a desk just a fraction of an inch closer, a shadow lingering just a little too long against the wall, but it was enough. Enough to make me doubt my own memory, enough to make me hesitate, enough to make me feel like I was being led somewhere, like something was pulling me toward an answer I did not want to find. And that night, when I finally gathered what little courage I had left and stepped back into the hallway, following the distant pull of that terrible, rhythmic whispering, I realized I wasn't the only one wandering the corridors after dark. The air was colder near the east wing, wrong somehow, heavier, thick with something unseen, something old, something waiting. The door at the end of the hall, the one I had never seen open, the one that had always felt just a little out of place, was ajar. I don't know what I expected when I stepped inside, don't know what I thought I would find, don't know why I pushed the door open with a shaking hand and let the darkness swallow me whole, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, as soon as I felt the floorboards shift beneath my feet, the whispers stopped. The room was small, impossibly small, like it had been carved out of the school itself, its walls lined with shelves that sagged beneath the weight of hundreds of glass jars, each one filled with something dark, something wet, something that glistened in the faint candlelight. My stomach lurched, my hands trembling as I reached for the nearest one, my breath catching as I turned it over, as the weak, flickering glow illuminated the single, bloodshot eye floating inside. There were names scratched into the glass, some old, the letters nearly worn away, some fresh, the cut still raw and jagged, and at the very end of the row, my breath caught in my throat, because I saw my own name. The jar was empty. My legs nearly gave out, my pulse roaring in my ears, my entire body screaming at me to run, but before I could move, before I could even take a breath, the door behind me slammed shut. The candlelight flickered violently, the air crackling with something unseen, something shifting, something waking, and in the suffocating silence, just before the darkness swallowed me whole, I heard it again, the whispering, right against my ear this time, soft, careful, patient. And this time, I understood. The whispering wasn't just sound, it was something deeper, something that slid beneath my skin, curled around my ribs, pressed against my skull like fingers trying to push their way inside. The moment the door slammed behind me, the entire room seemed to breathe, the candlelight shuddering, the air thickening with something wet, something heavy, something that made my stomach churn with the unbearable feeling of drowning on dry land. The jars lining the shelves began to rattle, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like hundreds of fingernails drumming against glass, and the whispering grew louder, no longer distant, no longer tangled at the edges of my mind, but right there, spilling into my ears, pulling me under, pulling me in. The words were still in that same guttural, twisting language, but now, somehow, I understood, not with my mind, not with my ears, but with something deeper, something older, something that had been waiting for me to hear it all along. It moved like a shadow, like a thing not meant to exist in this world, its body stretching and folding in ways that made my head ache to look at, its face shifting, flickering, changing. Sometimes it was something else entirely, something with too many eyes, too many mouths, something that should not be. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to claw my way back to the door, but my body wouldn't obey, wouldn't even tremble, wouldn't even flinch as the thing took a slow, deliberate step toward me, its face still twisting, flickering, shifting through all the faces I had ever seen, all the faces that had come before me. And in its outstretched hand, held carefully, reverently, like an offering, was a single, glistening eye. "Take it," the whisper sighed, softer now, so gentle, like a mother to a child, like a teacher to a student, like something that had always known me. The weight of the jar in my hands felt heavier now, heavier than glass, heavier than my own shaking limbs, heavier than the crushing realization that this was not a request. My body was not my own, my mind was slipping, unraveling, falling away, and as my fingers began to move, as I reached out, as I felt my skin brush against the cold, wet surface of the eye, I finally understood what happened to Miss Howard. I finally understood why Clara was gone. And worst of all, I finally understood why the students never blinked. I don't know how my body obeyed me, how my muscles broke free from whatever invisible force had been holding me still, how my legs carried me backward, away from that thing, away from the glistening eye still cradled in its outstretched palm. All I knew was that if I touched it, if I let it place that thing in my hands, I would never leave this room. My body lurched before my mind had even caught up, my limbs trembling, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as I slammed against the locked door, my fingers clawing at the wood, at the handle, at anything that could get me out, that could drag me back to the world I had known before I stepped into this place. But the thing in the shadows, it did not follow. It did not lunge, did not grab me, did not move from where it stood, only tilted its head, slowly, unnaturally, almost curious. And then, in a voice so low, so soft, so final, it whispered, "You cannot leave." The moment the words left its lips, the entire room shifted. The walls pulsed, breathing in slow, shallow movements, the floor beneath me stretching like muscle, pulling against my weight, resisting my every desperate push, my every frantic attempt to force the door open. The jars began to rattle again, louder this time, harder, their contents sloshing violently, as if something inside was trying to get out. My pulse slammed against my ribs, my chest tight with the sickening realization that I was going to be trapped here, that I had waited too long, that I had let myself get too close, that I was already part of this place in a way I hadn't understood until now. A voice, distant but familiar, something cutting through the suffocating silence, something pulling me back, something screaming my name. And in that split second of distraction, when whatever held me loosened its grip, I did the only thing I could. I don't remember getting through the door, don't remember when it unlocked, when my body finally broke free from the suffocating weight pressing down on me, when I stumbled into the hallway, my breath coming in sharp, painful gasps, my vision swimming with panic and exhaustion. But I remember the eyes. Not just in the jars now, not just in the walls, but everywhere. Watching from the darkness, staring from the shadows, blinking into existence in the spaces where light didn't reach. They lined the corridor, stretching into infinity, embedded in the paintings, in the ceiling, in the cracks between the stones, and with every desperate step I took, with every shaky breath I forced into my lungs, they followed. I could feel them pressing against my skin, weighing down my thoughts, crawling into the spaces behind my eyes, whispering without words, seeing everything. I don't know how I made it back to my room, don't know how I slammed the door shut behind me, how I collapsed onto the floor, my entire body shaking, my vision swimming, my pulse hammering so violently that I thought my ribs might crack under the weight of it. But even as I sat there, my back pressed against the cold wood, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts, I knew this wasn't over. The whispering hadn't stopped. The eyes hadn't vanished. And somewhere, just beyond the locked door, in the dark, waiting, watching, it was still there. And it wasn't waiting for me to come back. It was waiting for me to blink. I knew, deep in my bones, that this wasn't going to stop, that this wasn't something I could run from, that whatever had been waiting for me in that hidden room wasn't finished yet, that it was still there, still calling to me, still pulling me towards something I was never supposed to see. At some point, when the whispering became unbearable, when the walls felt too close, when I couldn't tell how much time had passed, I knew I had no choice, I had to leave. Staying locked inside this room, inside my own fear, wasn't going to save me. The school wouldn't let me go, wouldn't let me wake up from whatever nightmare I had stepped into, wouldn't let me pretend that I hadn't seen the empty jar with my name scratched into the glass. If I wanted to escape, if I wanted to end this, if I wanted to survive, I needed to know what had happened to the others. I needed to know where they had gone. And so, against every screaming instinct in my body, against every trembling muscle that begged me to stay where I was, I forced myself to move. The tunnels beneath Blackwood were never meant to be found. I knew that the second I stepped into them. The air was different down there, heavy with something damp, something rotting, something that clung to my lungs like mold, filling my throat with the taste of decay. The stone walls were slick beneath my fingers, uneven, ancient, carved with symbols I couldn't understand, symbols that felt alive, shifting whenever I looked away, as if the walls themselves were breathing. I don't know how far I walked, don't know how long I let the whispering guide me, don't know when I realized that the soft crunch beneath my shoes wasn't stone at all, but when the tunnel finally opened into a cavernous space, when the flickering torchlight illuminated the vast, writhing pit below, I understood. The eyes. Thousands of them. Twisting together, blinking in unison, their wet, glistening surfaces reflecting the flickering light in every direction. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to wake up. But I couldn't, because in the center of it all, in the very heart of that living, pulsing mass of sight, I saw them. The teachers. The missing ones. Miss Howard. Clara. The ones who had come before me. They stood at the edge of the pit, their bodies unnaturally still, their faces blank, their mouths slightly open, but their eyes, they weren't theirs anymore. Their sockets were empty, dark, hollowed out, but somehow, they were still looking at me. And just as I took a step back, just as my breath hitched, just as the horror of it all sank into my bones, they spoke. All of them, at once, in voices that were no longer their own, in a language that twisted and snarled and slithered through the cavern like something alive. You were chosen. The word struck me like a physical blow, a sound so wrong, so utterly impossible, that for a moment my mind refused to process it, refused to let it settle, refused to acknowledge that the empty, hollow-eyed thing standing at the edge of the pit had just spoken. Their voices were not layered but singular, as if they had become one voice, one entity, one thought stretching across time and flesh and memory, something ancient, something that had been here long before me and would be here long after I was gone. My breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, my chest tightening, my entire body locking into place as the whispering surged, 100 voices overlapping, crawling under my skin, pushing into my mind. I was going to pass out, I could feel it, the pressure, the weight, the unnatural, unbearable feeling of being looked at by something I could not see, something I could not comprehend. Then, suddenly, the voices stopped. The whispering collapsed into silence so thick, so complete, that it rang in my ears, buzzing behind my eyes, making my stomach churn with the absence of sound. And in that silence, in that heavy, suffocating stillness, one of them moved. Slow, jerky, unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. I didn't want to see, didn't want to watch, didn't want to know what it would do, but my body refused to look away, my eyes locked onto the figure as it took one slow, careful step forward, its head tilting, its lips barely parting, its breath hitching in something almost human, almost familiar. And then, before my mind could catch up, before I could truly process what I was seeing, it whispered my name. Emma. I choked on my own breath, my pulse slamming so hard against my ribs that I thought something might break, because I knew that voice. Clara. It was Clara. Not Clara as she had been, not Clara as I remembered her, not Clara the terrified girl who had tried to warn me, but something else, something that had once been her, something that still wore her voice, her shape, her face, but it wasn't her anymore. Her hollow, darkened eye sockets still watched me, still saw me, still knew me, even though there was nothing inside them, even though there was nothing left of her, even though she should not have been able to see at all. "You were supposed to help me," she whispered, and there was something almost fragile in the words, something that made my stomach twist with something worse than fear, guilt. Because I had known, deep down, I had known the moment I saw her disappear, the moment I saw the fear in her face, the moment she had tried to reach out to me in the dining hall. And I had done nothing. I shook my head, stumbling backward, my fingers digging into my arms, my breath coming too fast, too sharp, too close to sobbing, because I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain that I had been just as scared, that I hadn't known how to save her, that I hadn't even known how to save myself. But Clara, or whatever was left of her, didn't move any closer, didn't reach for me, didn't speak again. She only stood there, silent, waiting, her head tilted at that unnatural, broken angle, her empty eyes never leaving mine. And then, all at once, the whispering started again. Louder this time, frantic, desperate, closing in around me like hands, like teeth, like hunger. And in the cacophony of voices, in the overwhelming, suffocating sound of something ancient and endless, I heard the truth I had been trying so hard not to understand. I was never supposed to leave. I was meant to be here. And now, I had taken Clara's place. I don't know how I was still standing, how my body hadn't collapsed under the weight of the truth pressing into my skull, how my mind hadn't shattered from the unbearable knowledge that I was never meant to leave this place, that I had been led here for a purpose, that I had stepped willingly into the role someone else had abandoned. The whispering was everywhere now, weaving through the darkness, curling around my bones, slipping beneath my skin like a parasite burrowing deep, feeding on my fear, on my hesitation, on the sickening, gut-wrenching realization that if I didn't do something, if I didn't fight, I would end up just like Clara, just like Miss Howard, just like the ones who had come before me. But what terrified me most, what made my entire body seize with cold, unrelenting horror, was that some part of me was already giving in. I could feel it, the pull, the temptation, the slow, insidious thought creeping into my mind like a disease. What if I just stopped fighting? I took a step back, my foot nearly slipping on the damp stone, my breath sharp, uneven, my fingers digging into my own arms, my nails pressing deep, trying to anchor myself to reality, to my body, to my own mind. But the voices only grew louder, overlapping, twisting, turning into something almost soothing, almost familiar, almost safe. "You will understand," they whispered. "You will see. You will see forever." I shook my head violently, forcing the words out, forcing my own voice to break through the noise. "No," I gasped, my throat raw, my chest aching. "I won't. I won't be like you." The moment the words left my lips, the whispering stopped. The air around me went still, so unnaturally, impossibly still that for a moment, I thought time itself had frozen, that everything had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing. And then, from the farthest edge of the pit, from the deepest part of the writhing, blinking mass of sight, something stirred. A figure stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its movements too smooth, too precise, too controlled. It was taller than the others, its body wrapped in the same heavy, flowing black fabric I had seen in the old portraits lining the halls, its head tilting ever so slightly as it regarded me not with curiosity, not with anger, but with something worse. Recognition. And when it spoke, its voice was different from the others, lower, quieter, carrying with it the weight of something that had been waiting a very, very long time. "You don't have a choice." My stomach dropped, my vision blurred, my hands curling into trembling fists at my sides because I already knew that was true, didn't I? Hadn't I known it from the beginning? Hadn't I felt it the moment I stepped onto Blackwood's grounds? Hadn't I sensed it in the way the students stared, in the way Clara had tried to warn me, in the way Miss Howard had been erased? This was never a test. This was never a mistake. This was always going to happen. But then, another voice. Faint, distant, barely audible beneath the crushing weight of the silence. "There's a way out." I turned, my breath catching, my chest tightening so violently it hurt, because Clara, what was left of her, was still watching me. Her empty, ruined eyes locked onto mine, her hollow face unreadable, her body swaying slightly, like something was pulling her in two different directions, like she was fighting something I couldn't see. "Destroy it," she whispered, her voice raw, strained, breaking under some unseen weight. "The body. The one who started this. The one who built it." I didn't understand at first, didn't know what she meant, and then I did. Dr. Blackwood. His body had to be here, had to be somewhere beneath the school, had to be preserved in whatever nightmare ritual had been keeping this place alive, had been keeping them all trapped here. And if I could find it, if I could destroy it, I could end this. I ran. I don't remember how my legs carried me, don't remember how I forced my body to move when every inch of me was screaming to stop, to give in, to let the whispers consume me. The tunnels twisted around me, endless, shifting, pulsing like something alive, the walls stretching and shrinking as if the school itself was trying to trap me, to pull me deeper, to make sure I never left. The voices didn't scream anymore, they didn't have to. They only whispered, soft and patient, curling around my thoughts like vines, urging me to turn around, to let go, to accept what had always been meant for me. "You will see. You will see forever." My vision blurred, my breath burned in my chest, my pulse a violent, erratic thing slamming against my ribs, but somehow, impossibly, my body kept moving. And then I saw it. The chamber was vast, stretching impossibly high, the ceiling lost in the darkness, the walls lined with rows and rows of unblinking eyes, embedded into the stone, watching, always watching. But in the center of it all, resting on a crumbling, ancient altar, was a body. It wasn't rotting. It wasn't skeletal. It was preserved, untouched by time, untouched by death, untouched by anything natural. Dr. Edwin Blackwood lay as if merely sleeping, his hands folded neatly over his chest, his skin pale and smooth, his mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile. And his eyes were open. But they weren't his anymore. They belonged to all of them. The missing students. The missing teachers. Clara. Miss Howard. Every soul that had been swallowed by this place, their sight stolen, their presence absorbed into something far worse than death. If I stopped to think, if I let the weight of what I was seeing crush me, I would never move again. I grabbed the first thing I could, a rusted, jagged piece of stone broken from the altar, sharp enough, heavy enough, final enough. The whispers rose in a crescendo, desperate now, no longer patient, no longer coaxing, but pleading. The walls shuddered, the eyes widened, the ground beneath me trembled as if the school itself was fighting back, as if the very fabric of this place was trying to stop me, to pull me down into its depths before I could end it. I lifted the stone above my head, my entire body screaming, my muscles locking, my mind flooded with a million voices crying out at once. And then I brought it down. The impact was deafening. The whispers turned to screams, raw, agonized, inhuman. The body convulsed once, twice, before the skin began to crack, to split, to peel away like old paper, revealing nothing beneath it, nothing but darkness, endless, endless darkness. The eyes in the walls shattered, bursting like glass, the tunnel walls collapsing, the chamber splitting apart, and through the chaos, through the screaming, through the collapsing nightmare, I felt myself falling. And then, nothing. Silence. Stillness. Darkness. When I woke up, I was outside. The school was gone. There was nothing but rubble, nothing but broken stone and dust and wind where Blackwood had once stood. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for. I was free. I was alive. But as I stood there, breathing in the cold morning air, my hands still shaking, my heart still pounding, I realized something that sent ice crawling through my veins. My eyes felt dry. Too dry. My throat tightened, my fingers shaking as I reached up, as I touched my own face, as the horrifying, gut-wrenching truth settled deep into my bones. I hadn't blinked.